In early 2024, ByteDance, the company behind TikTok and Douyin, quietly redirected a portion of its artificial intelligence data center procurement away from Nvidia and toward Huawei's Ascend 910B accelerator. No press release, no regulatory filing, just a purchase order pointing in a different direction. The break did not come from the rule in Washington. It came from the buyer in Shenzhen deciding the domestic chip was close enough. That single procurement shift connects 5 links running from Nvidia's collapsing China revenue through the export controls that capped what Nvidia could legally ship, through the hyperscaler pivot toward Ascend, to the software fork now hardening around a different ecosystem entirely. Follow the chain and the story inverts. The restriction designed to protect Nvidia's position is the event that gave Chinese clouds the justification and the runway to get off the dependency. The move meant to hold the line force buyers off it. The export control did not sever the relationship, it gave the customer permission to build a new one, and that customer now manufactures the replacement. Start where the numbers are confirmed. Through roughly 2022 and into 2023, Nvidia held a dominant position in China's artificial intelligence accelerator market. The A800 and H800 generations were the hardware Chinese hyperscalers and research institutions scaled on, and China represented what Nvidia itself described in public filings as a significant portion of its data center segment revenue. That share collapsed sharply by 2024. Nvidia's own disclosures to the Securities and Exchange Commission documented the decline. Multiple analyst estimates from sell-side firms covering semiconductors place the drop at well above half of the prior peak, though the exact figures vary by source. The direction is confirmed. The magnitude is a range, not a single audited number. The cause is also confirmed, and it runs through the Commerce Department. In October 2022, the United States issued export controls restricting the performance thresholds of chips that could be shipped to China without a license. Nvidia responded by designing products specifically to land below those thresholds. The A800 and H800 were compliance products, engineered to the ceiling. Then, in October 2023, the Commerce Department updated the rules. The new performance thresholds were tighter. The A800 and H800, built to satisfy the prior ceiling, were now caught above the new one. Nvidia's legal, compliance-cleared product line for China was stranded. Federal Register notices documented the rule changes. Nvidia's public statements confirmed the compliance status of its products. Reporting from Reuters and the Financial Times covered the October 2023 update in detail. With a reliable Nvidia supply path closed, Chinese buyers faced a narrow set of options. They could source older, lower-throughput hardware that predated the controls. They could attempt to acquire chips through channels carrying legal and supply chain risk. Or they could look at what Huawei had been building. Neither of the first two options supported the training runs Chinese artificial intelligence labs were planning at the scale their roadmaps required. The third option was uncertain in a different way. Huawei's Ascend 910B had been shipping in limited volume since 2023, constrained in part by Huawei's own access problems at the leading-edge foundry level following restrictions imposed in 2020 on its ability to use Taiwan Semiconductor for advanced nodes. But constrained is not the same as absent. Multiple industry and trade reports documented order volumes shifting toward Huawei. ByteDance, Alibaba Cloud, Baidu's Artificial Intelligence Cloud, and Tencent Cloud all began redirecting procurement. Reuters, The Information, and Bloomberg each reported on Huawei Ascend order activity in 2024. ByteDance specifically was reported by multiple outlets to have placed large Ascend orders. Huawei's production ramp, though limited by its foundry constraints, reached deployment volumes at major hyperscalers sufficient to replace at least part of the Nvidia gap. This link is graded reported, not confirmed. ByteDance has not disclosed order figures. The sourcing is supplier adjacent, drawn from industry analysts and reporting rather than direct hyperscaler disclosure. The direction of the shift is credible given corroborating signals from multiple independent outlets. The magnitude is not nailed down. Here's where the chain inverts and where the expected cause turns over. A viewer tracking this story might reasonably assume the decisive break came from Washington tightening its rules past the point Nvidia could engineer around. That is not quite what happened. The decisive break came from buyers in Beijing and Shenzhen, concluding on their own commercial judgment that the Ascend 910B paired with Huawei's compute software stack had crossed the threshold of good enough, particularly for inference workloads and increasingly for fine-tuning. That is a procurement posture, not a compliance form. The restriction set the ceiling. The buyer chose the floor. Chinese hyperscalers responded by running dual stacks. Clusters built on remaining Nvidia hardware, running the CUDA software environment, operated alongside newly stood-up clusters running Huawei's compute stack on Ascend hardware. Engineering teams began porting workloads from one to the other. That porting process is itself the critical event. Every model that runs natively on Huawei's compute environment reduces the switching cost of the next migration. CUDA's advantage in China is no longer a function of its quality relative to alternatives. It has become a function of its installed base, and the installed base is the thing being methodically worked down. This link is graded reported, supported by developer community documentation, Huawei's own technical materials, and industry analyst commentary. Dual-stack deployments are inferred in part from engineering job postings and benchmark disclosures rather than direct confirmation from hyperscalers. The link the whole chain turns on is not the export control and not the Ascend chip itself. It is the moment Chinese hyperscalers decided that friction with a capped Nvidia was costlier than friction with an immature Ascend. That is a buyer's judgment call, made quietly at the procurement level, with no announcement. If that posture holds, the CUDA software environment's position in China erodes regardless of what Washington permits next. If it cracks, if the engineering overhead of Huawei's compute stack proves prohibitive at training scale, Nvidia re-enters and the fork collapses before it deepens. The chain's structural integrity depends entirely on that single commercial calculation. Consider how this plays out for a single concrete workload moving through the chain. ByteDance enters as the buyer who placed the order. The order goes to Huawei. The Ascend 910B cluster goes live in a data center. An engineering team is assigned to port a recommendation model, something already running on CUDA, over to Huawei's compute environment. The team documents what breaks. They file issues, they write workarounds, the model runs. It runs slower than it did on the Nvidia cluster, but it runs well enough for its inference task. The next model gets ported with somewhat less effort because the first team wrote the workarounds. 6 months later, new model development starts on both stacks in parallel. A year later, the question the engineering lead asks is not whether to use CUDA or Huawei's compute environment. The question is which one to deprecate first. Think of CUDA as the operating system a factory floor has standardized on. Every machine calibrated to it, every technician trained on it, every diagnostic tool written for it. A new machine arrives running a different system and performing at roughly 80% of the incumbent on most tasks. No manager replaces the floor on day one. But if the supplier of the original system announces it can no longer ship replacement parts, legally, indefinitely, the factory does not sit idle. It starts retraining technicians. It runs one line on the new system to see what breaks. 2 years in, institutional knowledge of the old system is thinning and the new one is thickening. The original system did not get worse. The factory simply stopped needing it to get better. The fifth link in the chain is directional rather than confirmed, and it is important to say so plainly. As Chinese hyperscalers port workloads and accumulate in-house expertise on Huawei's compute environment, the ecosystem around Ascend thickens. Model libraries, optimization frameworks, monitoring tooling, and engineering talent with Ascend-specific experience all accumulate. That is the same compounding dynamic that made CUDA sticky globally in the first place. The inference is that if this compounding continues, China's artificial intelligence infrastructure diverges into a distinct software ecosystem with its own dependency graph, incompatible with CUDA at the framework level. A fork deepened past a certain threshold of library coverage, and talent density becomes self-reinforcing. Nvidia cannot re-enter by shipping better hardware alone, because the software integration work would have to be rebuilt from scratch by developers who have already standardized elsewhere. That inference rests on the thinnest evidence in the chain. The signals are indirect: job postings, framework commits, benchmark claims from Huawei itself. None of those are audited, and Huawei has a direct commercial incentive to project confidence in its platform's maturity. The Ascend 910B's reported performance figures for large model training, where memory bandwidth and inter-chip interconnect matter most, have not been independently replicated at the scale Chinese hyperscalers would need for frontier model development. If training remains the bottleneck, the fork may stabilize as an inference and fine-tuning environment rather than a full replacement stack. That is partial decoupling. Meaningful, commercially significant, but not the clean severance the top of the chain describes. The chain from export control to ecosystem fork is directionally solid through the fourth link. The fifth link describes where the trajectory leads if the reported conditions hold, not a conclusion already in evidence. That distinction matters because this is the link the whole story could reverse on, and it would reverse quietly in training cluster utilization rates and model release notes, not in a press conference. A second call worth making explicit: the CUDA software environment's position globally is real and documented in developer adoption figures across the industry, but its protection in China specifically depended on there being no viable alternative to migrate toward. The Ascend 910B changed the denominator without matching Nvidia on absolute performance. That turns out to be enough. A moat defends a position. If the attacker builds a separate position next door and moves in, the moat becomes irrelevant to that occupant. China's hyperscalers are not storming CUDA's defenses. They are simply relocating, one workload at a time. The export control accomplished what it set out to do. Nvidia cannot ship its best hardware to China's largest artificial intelligence buyers. What the control could not do was prevent those buyers from treating the supply cut as a forcing function. ByteDance did not wait for permission to evaluate a send. It placed orders, stood up clusters, and began the engineering migration that reduces CUDA dependency, one ported workload at a time. The restriction drew the boundary. The customer drew the consequence. 5 links up the chain, the outcome is a software ecosystem fork that Nvidia's next chip cannot resolve, because the problem is no longer the chip. ByteDance is the observable test case at every rung of this chain, the buyer who turned, the named defector and the share loss data, the company now running both stacks and deciding which one to standardize on. The sanction was the starting pistol. Watch ByteDance's next major model release. If it ships with native Huawei compute stack optimization and CUDA support listed as secondary, the fork has hardened past the point of commercial reversal. If it ships CUDA first with Huawei's stack as an afterthought, the migration is still negotiable. That release note, whenever it comes, will tell you more about where this chain ends than any trade policy announcement. If you track where the chip competition actually settles, in software stacks and procurement cycles, rather than just fabrication nodes, subscribe and turn on notifications. That is the chain this channel follows.